I was born 1961 in Wurzburg and grew up in a little town close by. And already during my last years of school, I discovered that I really have a passion for painting. And so I decided to apply for Fine Art Academy after my bachelor. And it was good luck that I really succeeded the first time to apply, and I ended up in Stuttgart Fine Arts Academy. Of course, it was a big contrast with what I expected and what I discovered in the art school. It was a time, 6 years, full of experiments, full of discoveries of material, of discussions, of ideas. And the last years in academy, I realized that really my interest is in the relation between painting and sculpture. The idea of that a painting is not only a two-dimensional event, but it's also a physical three-dimensional object. This contrast was fascinating for me. I really discovered the constructivism, Malevich, and of course the minimalism, American abstract expressionism, and Frank Stella with his famous sentence, "What you see is what you see," was fascinating and was a little kind of starting point. And I reduced my whole form vocabulary into direction of very basic geometrical forms. On the other hand, I really quit the idea of making a painting on canvas. I needed to create my own body for the possibility to use the color. So I used different materials with more resistance, like wood, like aluminum, like found objects, metal objects. I used, instead of regular pigments, I used wax and tar, sand. It started a discussion between the three-dimensional materials and the possibilities of the color. And after the academy, I reduced more and more the idea of having a concentrated form based on a square, based on a rectangular form floating in the space. So I started to find different solutions how the object is related to the wall, with the dimensions, with the form, related to the architectural lines. 1985, I started with a series called Cuts. It started with a found object, found regular metal plates, and I wanted to react on this strong form of a rectangle and cut edges. I added lines, I cut lines. I wanted a relations between the outside form and the inside form. So it was a discussion between inside, outside. This idea of inside-outside became for me interesting when I made an installation in an independent art space close by Stuttgart. It was an old fabric hall, just a plain structure without walls, and I wanted to create a space inside the space. So the idea was to hang forms, plywood forms, in the architectural structure to structure the space, and open these forms. Open these forms like windows. So you have a variation of the same form in different positions, always related with the hole, with the window, to the next form behind him. So you could see as a viewer really different perspective, where you go to an object and the other object are inside this object, or you let the space flow inside the object, relation between the architecture structure and my geometrical forms. This was the idea of the windows, which is something I'm still related to this idea nowadays, when I changed from plywood to steel forms. In 1989, I started with a group of foldings. Folding in that sense that I really cut my metal plate into two parts and brought it in a different positions together. It looks like a folding, but the basic idea was to have two separate parts coming together in a certain angle and find a certain position on the wall. So it looks like a folded piece of metal on the wall. So the flatness of the two-dimensional 3mm steel plates became an object in front of the wall. These objects are always related to basic forms like rectangle, squared things, parallel things. But it's depending on the angle you look at it, because the dimension of the object is suddenly way far from the wall, which is a big difference to the group of cuts in the 90s. It was all related to much more to the wall. Now I had a really dynamic form, which was really forcing the people to find a position to recognize what is the structure behind this form, because from the front is completely different from the sides. And this is, of course, influences the shadow of the object on the wall. A very important thing for our perception to see volume is always the shadow, because it let us recognize the volume of an object. And suddenly, with a very reduced basic form, only folded, you create a shadow which is part of the object, and suddenly the space around becomes more and more important. And very soon was clear that the surface of this bended steel needs to be defined in a way. It needs to be expressed as a shape, and I decided to use lacquer paint with pigments, which gives a color which is very transparent, and depending on the angle where you look at it, it becomes different shades of the color. So the object was not only physically changing in the space, but also with the expression of the color. It became a dimension of a painting. So the 90s was a whole discussion about this position from the color to the wall to the object. In this discussion between the surface and the structure of the object itself with the foldings, and I tried to make a composition on the folded surface in terms of zones. There was a group of work called zones, where you have really interacting between the matte and glossy paint in relation to the shadow and the more bright side of a folded object. So a moment of irritation where you really have to think about what is the definition of this object. Is it a structure which related to two-dimensional, or is it an object which gives its own dynamic in position, in the angle, to the wall? In 2000-2001, I decided to leave the discussion about a surface which is not flat. And so I started with different groups of works. One was really called the basis, which is kind of cube, which is cut in certain ways, and the one side has paint, like a reference to a painting. I started with the idea of the base forms. That means a complete change of direction. I gave the object a space and a volume. I really built a block-like or a really three-dimensional corpus. And I decided to have the color only in a flat situation related to the surface of the object. That means I could show the material, which was in that time already the steel. But this was important to give also the idea what is the object made out of. Because the impression of a steel on the wall is an interesting fact in terms of how we look at the relation to the color, how we look at the relation to the wall. It's a heavy material. It gives the impression of really heaviness, of solidity, and on the other side, the one side painted with a color changes the sculpture impression of the volume into a base of a color field. So that was the idea, to bring the color in relation to a position to the wall. After discussion with the base group, I decided to start with a group of works so-called planes. Planes, in terms like the name says, it's something it's spreading out, something it's flat. And I had the idea that this shaped form, which has a structure that is easy to read, not enough influence the wall, the outside space. And I wanted to have an impression that color field is floating, has a special position to the wall, and give the idea of a kind of perspective, endless horizon. And for that, I remembered the idea with the cuts, that a cut is always dividing things. So the big form was divided in 2 or 3 parts that gave an inside structure, that gave a dynamic, that created lines which are spreading out and guides the form in a certain direction. And these forms had one side with a polished metal, and the main side was really intense color. And now the idea of a true inside-outside relation was born, because I had now the possibility to structure the object that helps to read the dimensions, to see how the parts are related. And on the other side, I could force the dynamic of the form into the space. So I separated the forms, mostly 3. That is the minimum of kind of clear discussion about what is inside, what is outside. And the space could really float into the lines. So the each part was separated with a gap. So if you approach to the object, you really see that there is a distance. And this created a complete new group of works where really now the composition of the object in combination of different parts and the dynamic into space gave a lot of possibilities. As I said, when I started my discussion about modern contemporary art at that time was influenced by minimalism, constructivism, and the discussion of the 60s, 70s. And it was interesting for me how I handle this problem with the perspective, because the perspective is a geometrical construction coming from the Renaissance, coming from this idea of the window looking outside. But with constructive art, it was something which was a misbehaving to use perspective. But for my idea as a dynamic object, I came to that point that you can do what you want, you're not avoiding the perspective, because it's in our way of perception that we see forms in the space. And that point was around 2010. I decided really to approach the construction of perspective really for my object. So I used really the geometrical construction related to the volume I use. And this gave another possibilities of group of works. I started to incline the angle of the works, so the metal part is more visible and gives a strong structure of a clear perspective. In relation to that, the color and the volume is something which pushes the object back to a painting. With the perspective, I realized I'm making rectangles in perspective. Any type of rectangle form in perspective gave this really sharpened, irregular forms. And at this point, I realized that the basic round form is a circle, and the circle in perspective is the ellipse. So it was interesting for me now to create an elliptic form to see how it's related to the idea of perspective in relation to a volume, because these objects really have a volume. And that was interesting because it's a composition on the wall, because our idea of seeing a circle as a perspective form is also strongly related to the white wall around. We need the space to let it flow. And so I started with a group of orbit works, which is mostly 2, 3, 4 elliptic works in different dimension to another. I changed the colors inside the work, different shades of one color, and this group is still going on. There's a lot of possibilities following up, but that was the interesting part, to have the elliptic form as a perspective of the circle in my work. Now I'm thinking about new forms, new ideas about material and color. What I discovered is that I love the idea to create a real sculpture, perspective sculpture, which is independent from the wall. Also, the Corten steel as a material which is able to create a beautiful surface like a color, but it's also possible to use it outside as a sculpture. And so the idea of forcing sculpture into painting and painting into sculptures give a lot of possibilities. I'm thinking of new structures, more dynamic. So that's my plans for the next years.